everyone for being here today for today's discussion. The title of today's talk is Cringeworthy. They say your art is too controversial, now what? There's a lot to unpack with that title, but before doing that, I want to introduce our guest today. Walter Robinson is a New York painter and art critic. His most recent exhibitions took place in Air de Paris in late 2021 and at the Galleria Mazzoli in Modena, Italy, opening at the end of 2020. Robinson also has shown his paintings in Geneva with Jeffrey Deitch Gallery, Pure Joy in Marfa, Charlie James in Los Angeles, Stems Gallery in Brussels. Robinson is credited with coining the term zombie formalism to describe a kind of process-based abstraction that became popular in the contemporary art market in 2014. There's a lot about Walter's career that I'd love to discuss with him today. I want to welcome you to our conversation. Walter, first of all, where are you coming to us from today?
I'm in my studio in Long Island City, New York. I'm a Queens artist.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm coming in from Hayama, Japan. And as I mentioned, I'll be in New York in a few days. So looking forward to connecting with you in person for the first time sometime soon. Today's topic, I know you and I've had a couple of preliminary conversations about this topic, but I wanted to ground our conversation in terms of like, what does it mean to talk about controversial art? As the discussion is described, artists often find themselves on the receiving end of intense criticism when they make so-called challenging work. So let's start with that first idea. This has also been intensified by the current political climate and the effects of social media. So Walter, when we first reached out to you about this subject, what was your immediate reaction to the idea of talking about controversial art? And you can talk about that from a personal standpoint and maybe even more broadly.
Well, I spent a lot of time as a reporter, as well as being an art critic and art reporter. And when it comes to controversy, I think for the press, it's a full-time job. And with the advent of social media, which really helped me a lot, it made a space for me as editor of ArtNet magazine. That made sort of tabloid sensibility even more pronounced, I think, out there with the notion of clickbait headlines and stuff like that. So controversy is always with us, and it's always good for readership. So.
And can you talk a bit about your experience, as a writer, critic, and whether or not you see this as something that kind of benefits the media in some regards? I mean, it seems to me that controversial work stirs the public interest. It generates, even before social media, it generates, what we now consider clickbait. What was your experience with that? I mean, is that something you saw as like sort of beneficial to your career in the media?
Oh, not so much. I think until both the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement, most controversy involved artists pitting themselves against the status quo, either politicians or bureaucrats or administrators. So it was peculiarly political in that way, that artists were working for a better world in opposition to the powers that be. So if you think of, I always like the piece the artist Dred Scott did, where he put a work on the wall, but to look at it, you had to stand on an American flag. And I think the American Legion objected to that very strongly. I always liked that. And of course, the Mayor Giuliani and Chris O'Feely's painting at the Brooklyn Museum, that was another amazing example. It points up the urge towards puritanical censorship that sort of dominates America, or that it's a strong current in American thinking, American culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. You must be reading my mind, because I was actually going to bring up Dred Scott's piece, straight away. I mean, that work was titled "What is the appropriate way to display an American flag?" And I remember all of the furor over that, all of the hype and all of the hoopla that just sort of like happened as a result of that work. I mean, even President Bush criticized the work, and I think Dred Scott, who I know actually, I met him many years ago. I think that's like one of his like shining achievements of his career, is that he got the president of the United States so upset that he's like mentioning him by name. But I think you're right. I mean, so much of what I think about when I think about controversial art, historically has been sort of connected to art that is rather political in nature, and kind of and then sort of like going against the system in many ways. But then you also, as you know, as an artist, there's also work that isn't necessarily political or sexual or violent in any way, but still kind of falls into this area of being considered controversial because it's work that appropriates other artists' work, or appropriates different items of consumer culture. Like, obviously Warhol comes to mind, and the Campbell soup cans. And at one point, I'm sure that, for a lot of people was unthinkable that could be considered, art in many ways. But, I think what I also want to just remind everyone who's joined us today is that, I'm also curious to hear others' opinions on this. I know there are many artists that have joined today's conversation that have their different experiences around what they might consider to be personal censorship. I think that in my conversations with artists over the years, I have found that there seems to be more of a welcoming of art that would have been considered very controversial 10, 20 years ago, that now we're seeing more art, that isn't sort of being pushed back against in the same way. I mean, I'm not saying that across the board, but certainly, Black artists, for example, and you mentioned Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think a lot of the opportunities that artists have to, speak on controversial topics through their work are probably broader now than they have been, and also they're able to get support for this work, both on the commercial side and also on the foundation side. What about some of your personal experiences in your career with your work, Walter?
Well, I try to avoid controversy at all costs, at all times. Unlike Dred Scott, who is an artist who, it's not that he courts controversy, but the work that he does is pointedly controversial. It addresses issues of politics and race that are in that area of controversy specifically. So I think in a way, there's a lot of artists who do that, who aim not only for political controversy, but for controversy for its own sake. And or maybe that's too harsh. I think artists in general many artists try to work on the edge of what's acceptable. And I was struck by one of the things Richard Prince said. I don't know if people remember, but back in the 90s, Richard was the focus of a certain amount of criticism for being sexist, because he made art out of jokes that were sexist. I came home from work, my wife made me a delicious dinner, and then we had sex, and I was in the wrong house. That's a sexist joke. And also he was making this series he called Girlfriends, which just photos he appropriated from biker mags. And so he was accused of being sexist. And he said actually that, and I kind of like this response, that he wasn't thinking about the reception of his work at all. He was just working alone in his studio where he felt completely free. And that kind of freedom is the fallback position that most artists take, I think. As for myself, a lot of my subjects would be controversial if anybody noticed them. I mean, I have series of paintings that I posit as a certain type of figure study, and they're based on advertisements from a massage therapist from Backpage. And there's several different ways that could be criticized, but so far it hasn't been worth anybody's time. And then, drawing from the kind of pulp imagery that I use, that stuff is just hot button issues left and right. It has issues of sexism and colonialism and violence. And I have to admit that earlier in my career, I was going for images of romance because I thought they were sweet. That was sweet, positive, good, what I wanted to be. But more recently, I'm trying to put out the more controversial image just out of a sense of mischief, to see how much trouble I can get into or how much provocation I can cause. So far, not very much.
We have a question that's come in that I'd love to run by you. This question is, Walter said something about how previously controversial work as going against the status quo. I'm curious about how does he go about determining the status quo today? The status quo of yesterday was a conservative, religious, patriarchal hegemony. And it seems many artists still position themselves against this specter. Does this perception of the status quo still apply in the neoliberal era?
I think the most interesting thing about the last decade is that there's a lot of criticism and focus on the art institution itself, as everyone knows. The management of our museums, the trustee boards, artist protests have chased corporate sponsors out of their museum space. They caused the resignation of a trustee who had a tear gas company, and I think I read later that he'd sold the tear gas company. Now, I don't know overall how much good that does, but at least the protest did raise the consciousness of one, very wealthy art patron, I think. As for the conservative apparatus, conservative impulses are alive and well in the US, as we know from the Republican Party. And that's one of the things I would like to see, like, more specifically partisan political art. The art world, the fine art world, still tends to shy away from being partisan for some reason. I think there's a bias against doing that kind of political art, although we do see it. I think, I'm sorry if I'm filibustering here, but I wanted to say, I do like Shepard Fairey's Obama Hope. That's an example of a political artwork that really caught fire. How many years ago was that, though? 12 years? It was a while ago.
At least.
Yeah.
At least. Well, actually, and something you mentioned, I think, is worth kind of coming back to. I think the controversy of surrounding art in the past several years has sort of like zeroed in on the institutions themselves in many ways. We still see artists, obviously, who kind of get swept up in the media storm over certain works. But this idea of artists being criticized for the work that they're making, but then the institutions that show the work and also benefit from the work, they should be subject to some scrutiny, as well. But I do feel aligned with your question about, whether removing one board member from one museum makes a huge difference in the overall structure and architecture of the art world itself. We have another question that's come in. How do you think controversial art has been affected in this age or by this age of cancel culture? I have some thoughts on that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it seems to me that we have some new constraints, that artists today have definite constraints, and most of them, I think, revolve around identity as well as sexuality. So I think on Halloween, you're not allowed to wear the costume of a you're not allowed to wear a sombrero on Halloween unless, I guess, you're Mexican. And I can understand that. And that kind of sensibility, I think, has spread through the art world, I think. But I'm not sure anybody was making that kind of art anyway, really. I mean, it does build, I think, these barriers, and this increasing awareness of identity, of ethnic or racial or cultural identity. It's I think it can serve to build barriers as much as to spur diversification. I don't diversity. I don't really know. It's an interesting problem that we're going to have to see what happens.
Yeah, and I think you're right that we are going to have to see. I mean, when I think about cancel culture and as it relates to, you know, the art world, I mean, I feel like artists are the people in society that should have the widest berth to explore ideas that may make people uncomfortable. And this idea that artists should limit their ideas or their creative output for fear of being canceled or backlash. I mean, I think it can be problematic. I mean, and again, this is coming from the perspective of understanding that a lot of the sensibilities that people have. But it's funny, you know, you mentioned Halloween and the sombrero scenario. And, you know, obviously it's just like an example, you know, of situation. But, you know, one could then say, well, if you think about the holiday itself, right, like Halloween as a holiday itself, I mean, that fundamentally isn't necessarily a holiday that everyone would even think is applicable to them or even, you know, makes them feel comfortable. So I think as we start peeling back the layers of this onion, you know, so to speak, there are all sorts of things that we have to kind of consider when we start thinking about people's sensibilities. And you also mentioned identity. And I've talked to a number of artists of different ethnic backgrounds who, you know, who feel uncomfortable with the idea of even creating work that is depicting stories that they don't feel is their own story or their own story to tell. And it's, you know, I think that I get it, but I also think that from an American perspective, I mean, we're both American, from an American perspective, America's story is ridiculously complicated anyway, and fraught with all sorts of issues. And so if you're an artist, if you're an American artist and you want to tell that story, there's so many things that you have to touch on that aren't going to be things that make people comfortable, because so much about America's history is uncomfortable. You know,
that's for sure. Yeah.
You know, so how do you, so, you know, if I was asking you that question, and again, we're not here today to tell people what to do or how to be. But I just wanted to, you know, if we were in a bar and there was a beer between us, you know, this is the same kind of conversation I'd like to have. I mean, it's sort of, you know, as an artist, how do you navigate that in your own work? I mean, you know, if you're telling the story of the country that you live in any painting that you might be doing, then you're going to touch on things that are sensitive.
Well, I think that Pollyanna that I am, that people like me, WASPs, old white guys, now that our vocation, our avocation has been opened up, and I think that's something that's happened in the last 5 years in a sort of astonishing way, that once people have a chance to tell their own stories, like before it was just us telling our stories, or maybe in a minority sense, people would tell their stories and they wouldn't be mainstreamed or they'd be just exemplary. But once everyone has a chance to tell their stories and have told their stories, then I can imagine coming out on the other side with sort of a new openness, a new acceptability of various kinds of collaboration, and it won't seem so much like appropriation of things that aren't yours, you know. But I think as an artist to proceed, it's, well, I don't know. I think with Open Casket, I think Dana Schutz was proceeding without any animus whatsoever. And she was caught up in this cultural moment that was painful for a lot of people. So my idea that maybe I can put out things that are challenging and controversial and do it with a sense of distance, that this is an arena where people can look at this controversial imagery and discuss it. Maybe I'm being naive to think that that's a possibility, because that's sort of where I am. If I'm working on this paintings that involve this weird body of imagery that expresses American colonialism with the fantasy of white soldiers being ravaged by beautiful foreign women. You know, there's a certain amount of this kind of imagery from the 50s and 60s. It's a sort of odd masochistic sexual undercurrent to colonialism. So the imagery is so odd that it's hard to believe that I could seriously be canceled for it. And like I say, I don't think I'm important enough for anyone to cancel. So if an artist can take a naive position, and then, you know, I'm just putting it out there for people to see. But yes, you have to also have a thick skin, I think. Right? I mean, being dragged over the coals on Twitter and elsewhere is not fun. I know I'm a sensitive guy.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, and again, I don't want to make this, you know, a conversation too focused. You know, I'm not trying to drag you over the coals or on any points today. And you know, but I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on that. You mentioned Dana Schutz, and you know, obviously there was that whole big controversy, the Whitney Biennial some years ago, and this painting of Emmett Till's, you know, dead body, and you know, and it's interesting to me because I often wonder when I think about that situation. I heard about the controversy before I saw the painting. And I know that then my perception of the painting was completely thrown off by everything that was sort of like surrounding it. Mm-hmm. And I tried to distance myself from the controversy, you know, let some time go by, then look at the painting again to kind of better understand how I feel about it. And, you know, I think for me, when I think about that, there are days I feel differently about it. There are days I feel differently about the controversy. There are days I feel differently about the painting. And I think that, you know, for me, that has given me a sense of like, you know, I feel good about that. I feel good that I don't have these sort of like entrenched views that are immovable, right? There are some days where I wonder about the intention of the artist, the intention of the institution. And then there are days where I feel completely benign about it. And I just go, you know, it's an interesting painting that should exist. And whether she painted it or someone else to me, is not incredibly important. I think that what happened to Emmett Till is actually more important than the painting, and it's more important than the controversy, and it's more important than any of the posturing that has gone on around it. I remember, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this one painting, on this one issue, but I have a sort of like a personal story. You know, when I was in high school, I had heard of Emmett Till by name, and I knew a little bit of the details of you know, what had happened to him. But I recall one day being in a classroom, and I was a member of a club, and they showed a film about it, right? And so I was completely unprepared for them to show the actual, you know, the image of his body in that casket. The actual image, you know, and it was published, it had already been in magazines, of course, but I hadn't seen it before. And, you know, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. It really had a significant effect on me emotionally. And I think about that reaction that I had to to that photo at the time, and maybe I was 15 years old when I saw it. And then I'm reminded that we are talking, and in some instances, we are talking about people who have felt real pain. And I don't mean Emmett, I mean like his family and people who were kind of connected to that situation. So I think, you know, on those days where I feel sort of melancholy about it, I think I'm channeling and remembering that despite all of the controversy and all of the media hype and all the social media and everything that went on around, and at the end of that, you have family and friends of family of this boy who was murdered in that way, and that their feelings still reverberate. And that might have been sort of like part of like what all of that was about. But anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent. There's a statement here in the comments. The assumption was that white people weren't entitled to be emotionally devastated by Till's murder and then pain about it. Yeah. I mean, I think that was the assumption, right? And boy, now we got like more Emmett Till comments. It's like, I know that was like a can of, like once that was opened up, that Pandora's box. Is it the painting of Emmett Till or the artist that is the problem? Object versus messenger situation. So I want to address both of those comments and questions, but I also want to, you know, just for the sake of disclaimer here, I knew with this conversation, once we brought up that piece, that we were gonna like have to spend some time on it. But certainly I just want to remind folks that I would love to also talk about other things. So let's, you know, so we're not going to spend the remainder of this conversation on this one subject, but we're here. So let's kind of talk about it a bit. So this first comment, the assumption was that white people weren't entitled to be emotionally devastated by Till's murder and then pain about it. I mean, I'll chime in on that. Yeah, I mean, I do think that what's and this kind of connects to what I said earlier about like telling America's story. What's interesting to me is that if you're an American artist, regardless of your race, if you're trying to tell America's story, then you're going to have to address things that aren't necessarily just deeply personal to you, right? Because it's like there's a lot to be told and to unpack. I think that this person is right, that there are people who felt that, you know, like that is a trauma, that is an issue, that is specifically, you know, one that was felt by African Americans, and then that for this artist who's not African American to then wade into that water, so to speak, and deal with that was insulting to some people. And I don't personally agree with that. I think that any civilized human being should be emotionally devastated by what happened to that young man, and should be able to express it. That's just me. And again, I'm expressing my own personal opinions here, not the opinions of New York Academy of Art or Walter's opinions. I'm expressing Dexter Wimberly's opinions. And then the other comment here, is it the painting of Emmett or is it the artist that's the problem? Well, I have an opinion on that. Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Walter?
You know, I like that you use the word melancholy when you remember the situation of the painting and the artist, as opposed to outrage. And it makes me think that I must be particularly hard-hearted, because with a lot of these controversies, and I think a lot of us can just dismiss them as not my business. It's not something I care about. It's not something I'm going to get really excited about. It doesn't mean that I have callous feelings about what happened to that boy or anything really. But what's interesting about it is it's like Will Smith at the Academy Awards. It really means nothing, and nobody really cares, but everybody has a lot to say about it. So
right.
That's like an interesting, I mean, our sociability, our sociology, that we all like to do a certain amount of chatter about stuff. I guess it ends up building consensus. That's how we build consensus. And now with social media, it's really widespread. But so many different opinions about, or rather all the different opinions are stated about those two guys, and in the end, I don't really care one way or the other.
Right. And for clarification, I mean, obviously we're talking about like all of the hype around these things. And it's funny, when we planned today's talk, obviously this Oscar situation hadn't happened. So we might as well address it. And it's funny. I pride myself on someone who can ignore celebrity BS, but I will admit to you that I got swept up into the Will Smith, Chris Rock situation, but for very particular reasons. And I guess as we're talking about this, they are two artists. Obviously, they're not visual artists, but they're artists in their own right with their own, issues. I think I got swept up into that situation because it felt like two people who I don't know either of them personally. I think I've met Chris Rock before. I've never met Will Smith. I don't know either of them personally, but it felt like seeing two friends fight. And again, it's silly because they're not my friends, right? Like it's like, and I have no dog in the fight, like none whatsoever. No matter what happens, it will have absolutely no impact on me personally. But I did feel somehow invested in the outcome, and I guess that's just me being, like admitting that I think between the social media and the news cycle, they did a bit of a number on me. But I think that what I also feel about that is that never before have I seen something so inconsequential get so much attention so quickly, unilaterally across all media. And I think there's like a lesson there for artists as well, for visual artists as well. I mean, there's definitely this huge like rat trap just waiting to snap on anything that happens, no matter how insignificant. And it's quite bizarre. I mean, but to your point, it doesn't matter. Like it ultimately doesn't matter. And I often feel like with most controversy, if you wait long enough, people just kind of move on.
That's true. That's true. I'm thinking of a gay curator who got caught up in the gay version of Me Too, and he lost his job. But I liked what he said. He said, "I've always been open about my sexuality," and he didn't apologize. He just made that one statement. And maybe since the gay art community has different dynamics than the straight art community, he went on to, I think, open a gallery. You probably know I'm talking about Bill Arning in Houston, and he seems to be doing fine with the gallery. And I kind of got to admire him for just riding it out. And guess I don't know if you could. I guess that in terms of, I don't know, I should stop talking.
So we have a comment here. Some controversy has destroyed careers and lives before other people moved on. Thinking of the writers, artists, and teachers during McCarthyism. Absolutely right. And I think that when the state or this sort of like governmental machine, we're dealing with something a bit different than sort of like the culture police, so to speak. But like when the real police are involved, then it's something I think of a different magnitude. But I also want to touch on something you said earlier about like, and I know this conversation could go anywhere, but it's like this whole idea of like the lack of bipartisanship, in the art world. And maybe you could sort of like share a little bit more about that idea, like what you mean.
Actually, it has to do with certain kinds of, I guess it has to do with white supremacy and arguments and the battles against white supremacy. And often that's that's phrased in black versus white or white versus black. And I always like to think that it'd be better if it were put in partisan terms. You have Democrats who are trying to ally themselves with people of all types, and then you have the Republicans who are resisting it. And it seems particularly clear today when, you know, the entire Republican Party will vote in lockstep. And I guess it was the Senate panel, the Republicans on the Senate panel, for instance, voted against approving that that judge who was nominated. So it's really clear to me that you have like a dark side and a light side. And often in our discussions of white supremacy, that's not emphasized, that's ignored. It's all white people. And God knows being white can be seen as some kind of sickness. But I often like to think, like, let's put it in partisan terms. Maybe that will move us politically in a more efficient way.
No, I think that's I want to get to this next question too, but something you just said just reminded me of an experience I had in Grand Rapids during Art Prize. This is a big sort of like citywide, you know, art thing that they did, and this must have been 5 years ago or something. So I was one of the judges, and so there was a painting in one of the venues. There were seemed like hundreds of venues. It was endless. There was a painting in one of the venues, this massive painting of Donald Trump doing something. And again, this was before the election, I believe. Donald Trump doing something, and it made it to like the final sort of like, not the final round of like 10 paintings or anything like that, but it was a painting that the judges were talking about. And I got the sense that because all of the judges were likely aligned politically, that like no one could
on the left.
Yeah. No one could actually see the painting, like for what it was. It was like that painting had no chance from the moment the paint dried. It had no chance of winning that prize because no one was going to vote for that painting, no matter how good of a painting it was, right? Because although it wasn't a propaganda painting to sort of make him look good, and if I'm not mistaken, it also wasn't a painting that was set up to make him look terrible. But it didn't serve anyone's agenda enough to, as my humble opinion, anyone's agenda enough to vote for it, right? So this comment's coming. Can we talk a bit more about cringeworthiness and what does that mean and how does it change over time? Great question. So, you know, in thinking about it for the subject of today's discussion, you know, well, all talks need a title, right? And I thought that would be one that people would find engaging. But also when I think about cringeworthiness, I think that it does change over time. I think it does have a different connotation and definition depending upon the moments we're in. I think that most art that I've experienced that I consider to be very, very provocative art might not be viewed that way in 20 years, and certainly would have been not even something you could show 50 years ago. I think as the time changes, our definitions and reactions to things change. It makes me think a bit about Kara Walker, right? But just as an artist who I often, I would encounter her work all the time. I mean, she's very well known and established, and I consider her work by some degree to be cringeworthy, right? Like it makes you stop in your tracks. You have a visceral reaction to it. I recall going to her. It may not have been her most recent show at Sycamore Jenkins, but maybe some years ago. It was a big show, and I personally found myself having a desire to just leave immediately. And I'll tell you why. It wasn't the quality of her work, and I don't think that's ever been an issue, in my opinion. Like for me, I remember also her Sugar Baby installation at the Domino Factory in Williamsburg, It was never the quality of the work. I felt that I wasn't the audience for the work.
That's exactly how I felt. I saw that show at that gallery and I felt like leaving. I felt it wasn't for me. And I hope to think I recognize that feeling as some kind of strange agglomeration of context and my own psychology and my history, and that it's not something that's absolute, but rather it's a kind of special reaction that the work causes.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear. I mean, my reaction was that this is not for white people. This is for Black people. But since you didn't like it, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I didn't
I'll
say you
tell
didn't
you.
like it. That
Yeah, yeah,
you had.
yeah. I'll tell you why I had that reaction. I mean, and again, it's personal. Because of my understanding of American history, and again, from reading about it, being educated about it, but then also having my perspective as a Black person in America, Black American. A lot of what was being said in that show were things that I had already gone through the emotional roller coaster and trauma and gauntlet already. I'd already tried to, was already carrying that, had already unpacked so much of that, already had so much of that I was yet to unpack. And seeing images of, and again, there were a lot of images of a lot of different things in the show. So I don't want to just make it seem as though it's like one thing, but, I'm not interested in seeing images of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not interested in seeing images of the antebellum South. And I'm not interested in seeing people like Black bodies hanging from trees, because I've seen it so much, and it is important for people to see it. It's important for that artwork to be made. It's important for it to have for her and any other artist who's making that kind of work to have a voice. But me personally, I feel like that work should be seen by people who are not aware of those atrocities or clear on that history, or still trying to engage with it. And I haven't moved on from it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that. My immediate reaction was, okay, I don't think I want to like have this experience today. It just wasn't an experience that I wanted to have that day. So say, are you saying Kara's cringeworthiness has passed its shelf life because this happens to everyone? Well, I do believe that that work today, if it never existed and it was created today for the very first time, it would not have the same impact. That's for sure. I think that in many ways, Kara's career and her work landed at a time where it was needed, and it was like a bomb exploding, because people just weren't used to seeing that kind of work. And certainly, who she is as an artist also, I think, people were like, wow, this is, it's fantastic. It's new for the moment. But I think now works that deals with the history of slavery and America's past. I think there's so much work like that out there. There's so much of it out there.
I think you're right when you point out how sort of revolutionary or how new that kind of imagery was when she did it. And I think also one could argue that it continues to evolve. And I think one of my reactions to that show was that it was harsher than ever. That it was harsher than ever. I think I remember at first thinking there was this erotic current in it that somehow tempered the racism, but then at that exhibition, I thought I must have been completely wrong. So you can argue that it's not worn out, that she continues to evolve, and it seemed of its moment, because the show was maybe 3 years ago at the height of Black Lives Matter or something. I don't know.
Well, it may be two different shows. I think we're talking about the same show, but it was. I mean, this pandemic has everyone in a time, like the time just seems so.
That's right. Maybe it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was like 5 years ago, but we've lost but we've lost 2 years. But that's the other thing too. You sort of have to, I think when your work is of that nature, in order for it to stay potent as an artist, you often, I think you like have to like lean into it more, right?
Mm.
So there's other side, there's another side to this. Why am I forgetting this writer's name? It'll come to me. But anyway, I was just listening to an interview. Jon Stewart was talking, the author of Warmth of Other Suns. And it's funny, I've read her books and I'm just like drawing a blank right now. It doesn't, it's not really important. What's important is that, the conversation was about continuing this dialogue around America's history, because there's still so much about it that people today are either in denial about or just don't know at all. And I remind myself that too, that I am just one person with one set of experiences. And I may not necessarily think that that work is for me, but it's definitely important work and it's for others. There's a comment here. I volunteer as a physician in Africa. Some of the patients allowed me to take their photograph. I made large paintings of them with the hospital director's permission. I illustrated their predicament of healthcare challenges in a rural hospital in dignified, non-explicit way. The people were depicted as beautiful with beautiful fabric wrapped around them. As a white volunteer physician, am I appropriating when I share these paintings with the Western world? Okay, big question. And thank you someone for chiming in with Isabel Wilkerson, who, if I knew her personally, would probably kill me because like I'm such a big fan of her work, but sometimes, the brain does what the brain does. So thanks for that, Amy. Anyway, so back to this person's question about appropriation. Walter, you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose that's one of the downsides of the new sensibility, that it seems difficult for a white person to make and display paintings of Black people. I suppose you can go ahead and do it.
Yeah. Well,
Nobody's
there's another layer, but I also think to this person's question, there's also another layer, right? Because I read this as exactly what you just said, Walter, which is that definitely there is this like ongoing debate about that, right? About whether, people from one ethnicity can paint, because if you say white artists shouldn't be allowed to paint Black people, which I don't agree with actually, personally, just to be clear, then does that mean that a Black artist can't paint someone who is, say, from India in religious garb? I mean, these are this.
I know it's insane. Are there any white people in these paintings? Maybe if there were Black and white people in the painting, that would be okay. I don't.
Well, I won't say the person's name, even though it might be clear to anyone else who's in this this webinar. But anyway, to your question about appropriation, well, I think there's another layer to this. I mean, one might think that because these people are in a hospital and they're vulnerable, and maybe
even their consent is questionable.
Right.
Of course, you're going to consent to whatever your doctor suggests, right?
Right.
You're in trouble.
So I think I wouldn't, for me to have, and again, I'm not again being prescriptive here and trying to tell someone what to do or not to do. I just want to address this question in my own, as it's rattling around in my own head. I think that part of the issue that people might have with that situation, there's the racial issue. But even if there were no racial issue, I think the other issue is whether or not people in a vulnerable position, like being a patient in a hospital who could be suffering or some degree of suffering, whether or not they are being taken advantage of, and whether or not their suffering or their trauma is being exploited. And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that is potentially one of the other layers of that, and whether or not they were compensated. because clearly they're in a vulnerable position. They're sick, they're in a hospital. So if anyone should be compensated for being a quote unquote model for a painting, it's that person. um,
You know
so
what I like about what you're saying is the issue is fairness, and we see so much concern with fairness in art and aesthetics today, and it makes me think, what is all this obsession with being fair? Why not be a little bit unfair? And
Hmm.
and then I would move sideways and say the artist has to hope that the artworks themselves will be their own alibi, that somehow the artworks will carry the day. You
Mhm,
know?
mhm. No, I agree with you there. And someone chimed in, this type of question probably shouldn't be asked of an artist. We can go back to the New York Times ethicists, let them determine the morality of it all. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that, hey, I approach these things from the standpoint of continually evolving. And as you mentioned before, Walter, when I mentioned melancholy as opposed to outrage, you know, melancholy is a completely different, different, feeling. Um,
It seems
and
more human. It seems more giving. It seems more giving than outrage.
yeah, yeah. So the person said that the purpose is to share the problem of healthcare inequities. I mean, I think that there's layers to this. I mean, everyone has their mission for what they're doing, but I think in this one particular scenario, as it's been described, I would say, to your point, Walter, about having a thick skin. So the person asking this question about whether or not they're appropriating the images of these people to create these paintings, but their reason for creating the paintings is a genuinely good reason to sort of shine a light on issues in the healthcare system. But I would just say, be careful. And again, maybe I shouldn't even say that because, it's like, then I'm being prescriptive, but like, who am I to tell someone to be careful? So I'm going to say be careful, but I don't mean this in some sort of like, I'm telling you what to do kind of way. But be careful, because we can often, myself included, I think we can often be blinded by our own honorable intentions
Mm.
and
I,
forget.
I suppose in terms of practicalities, there's an issue of whether this person could lose their job or not. And if you're just an individual artist, then you can tough it out. If you might lose your job from some kind of cancel culture objections, then you need to think twice, I suppose.
Right, right. Right. Someone said that, sorry, they can't see the question, but as a surgeon and artist, they think it's wrong to paint patients. Yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate, I think that's a
That may
legitimate,
be an ethical, part of the ethics of medicine. I don't
right,
even
right.
know.
Well, privacy, I mean, and again, I mean, from an American perspective, I mean, obviously privacy means different things in different countries. I mean, I think as a human being, I have this humanistic idea of like, everyone should be entitled to privacy, right? Like, that's like just me, is like, someone who likes privacy feels like people should be entitled to it. But I also realize that I'm also coming at this from the perspective of an American who's used to dealing with the American medical system, as terrible as it is. And this whole idea of like, hospitals be HIPAA compliant, and you're not supposed to share patients' details, without their permission, even though they probably do. And there's a right to privacy and all of these things. So when I think about patients being painted, and then those paintings going out into the world, I think my first question would be whether or not they gave permission that wasn't under duress, and whether or not they were compensated in a way that they found to be equitable. But again, there's probably more questions to ask than sort of like answers and thoughts to give. And you're right, that is, someone's talking about the Hippocratic Oath,
It
but
is
again,
interesting. There's plenty of room there's plenty of images of sick people
no,
in
of
the
course.
world, but the question of whether the physician should be producing them, that's sort of an interesting question I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, there, and also there's all these, and there's artists of all different backgrounds that have taken photographs of people in various stages of poverty, right? Some of the most famous photographs that have ever existed have been of people in different stages of poverty. And when I see those photographs, I often wonder, about that too, right? About the fairness issue, right? Um, the compensation issue, the appropriation issue, the permission issue, all these things that come to mind, and some things that I will never know the answer to. We're down to the final few minutes here. So I just want to encourage the folks that are here, if there are any other questions or comments that you want to bring to bear, now would be the time, because we're going to be wrapping up fairly soon.
Let me jump in with one other issue, the aesthetic issue. There's this great photographer, Sebastião Salgado, and he makes these amazing photos of, I don't know what, are they diamond miners? And they're so highly aestheticized. It's so beautiful. So you have to consider, what does it mean to make a beautiful picture of oppressed people?
Yeah. This is that's a good question. And I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer at all. I think that while we're waiting for maybe, one more. Someone said they thought this would be more about sex and voyeurism and stuff, and not political. Well, we could talk about sex and voyeurism for the final few minutes, but I don't think that would. I don't think.
I always like to think that when it comes to objections to sexual imagery, the problem is your perception. Like the image is of a human body is one thing, and if you object to it, for instance, with Baltus, the objections against his paintings of young girls, the people who are upset by those images obviously have perverted ideas about young girls and their sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah,
that's my all-purpose alibi for that.
And I'll say this, I'll speak to my own personal biases before we wrap up. There's very little art, very few things I've seen in the time that I've been a curator that I have felt I wish they didn't exist. Like, I'm talking about art wise, that I felt like I just wish it didn't exist. Very, very few things. It would have to be beyond the pale, things I wouldn't even speak of on this webinar. But I do realize that I have my own biases against certain kinds of violence, and certain kinds of depictions of poverty that I probably steer clear of whenever I'm thinking about my curatorial work, because I think, like, I just have my own limits, and I'll admit to those limits. I like to think that I'm a anything goes kind of person, but I know that I'm not, and I'll admit that, and I'm okay with that, because I just think that as a human being, there should be these things that you are perhaps not willing to do.
I'll tell you, I think it was the last Whitney Biennial, or maybe it was the one before, go through the whole exhibition, I like this, I don't like that, no problem. But I put on the VR headset for a Jordan Wolfson piece that in VR imagery showed one guy beating another one to the street while I think Hebrew letters floated through the sky, maybe. And I ripped that headdress off. I was outraged. And of course, the first thing I realized was that nothing else in the show had affected me the same way as that image of violence, which seemed totally gratuitous, So
yeah,
if you want to get a tough reaction, you can do tough stuff.
Yeah. Well, Walter, I want to thank you for your time today. We've come to the end of what could be a conversation that could be twice as long. And maybe when we meet in person sometime soon, we can pick it up from where we left off.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
Well, if anybody's still in the audience, thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah, I want to thank you all as well. I want to thank New York Academy of Art for providing this platform for this conversation. And please make sure that you are on their mailing list, or tell a friend. We have other great lectures coming up, in the near future. So thank you, Walter. Have a fantastic evening, and I hope to see you soon. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Cool.
Bye-bye.